Welcome to Sinister Truths, the channel where dark history, hidden stories, and unsettling realities come to light. Before we begin, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. She arrived in Georgia on a morning so bright it felt cruel. The sun hung low and gold over the fields, touching the dew on the cotton leaves until they glittered like scattered coins, while the wagon creaked along the red dirt road as if announcing her to the land. She did not look up at the sky. She had learned long ago that beauty could distract a person into mistakes. Instead, she watched feet, wheels, shadows, listened to tone and rhythm, measured breath and silence. From these things, she learned more than others ever did from words. Her name, as spoken by the trader, was Ruth. It was not the name her mother had whispered into her ear years earlier in another place, another life, before the world had narrowed into chains and rules and punishments. Ruth was a name chosen for convenience, a soft name meant to suggest obedience and faith. She accepted it the way she accepted everything else, outwardly, without resistance. Resistance, she knew, was most powerful when it was invisible. The plantation sat beyond a line of oaks heavy with Spanish moss, their branches drooping like tired arms. White columns rose from the earth, tall and clean, holding up a house that looked less like a home and more like a declaration. Power lived there. Fear lived there too, though it hid behind lace curtains and polished silver. She felt it before she ever crossed the threshold. Fear always had a smell, sharp, sour, masked with perfume. The man who purchased her was named Elijah Mercer. He was not cruel in the loud way some men were. He did not shout or strike without reason. Instead, he spoke softly and expected the world to arrange itself according to his wishes. Men like that believed themselves righteous. They were the easiest to deceive. Elijah's wife, Margaret, stood on the porch when Ruth was brought forward. Margaret Mercer was thin and pale, her mouth held tight as if words were dangerous things that might escape if she relaxed. Her eyes lingered on Ruth with something between curiosity and discomfort, as though she were looking at a mirror that showed a version of herself she did not want to acknowledge. "This one looks quiet," Margaret said. "She is," the trader replied quickly. "Smart too, but not troublesome." Ruth lowered her gaze just enough. Not so much that it looked like fear. Fear invited control, but enough to signal submission. She had practiced this balance for years. A bowed head that still listened, a silence that absorbed everything. Margaret nodded, reassured. Quiet slaves were safe slaves. Quiet slaves did not disrupt dinners or whisper things that lingered in the mind at night. Ruth was led to the back of the house and shown her place among the others. She memorized the layout as she walked, the narrow hallway, the way the kitchen opened toward the yard, the distance between the well and the quarters, the angle at which the master's study window caught the afternoon light. She counted steps without moving her lips. She noticed which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck, which servants avoided one another's eyes. That first night she did not sleep. She listened. The plantation spoke after dark, walls carried voices, floors remembered footsteps. From the main house came muffled arguments, sharp whispers that cracked with tension. From the quarters came softer sounds, grief folded into murmured prayer, laughter used as armor, the quiet sob of someone who had learned not to cry aloud. Ruth lay still and let it all pass through her. By morning, she understood more about the Mercers than they would learn about her in years. Margaret was afraid of being replaced, not by another woman, but by irrelevance. She feared her husband's respect slipping away more than his affection. Elijah, for his part, feared disorder. He feared scandal, whispers, anything that might disrupt his standing among other men like him. Their children, Thomas and Eliza, lived under the weight of expectation like stones placed carefully on their backs. Thomas tried to please and failed often. Eliza watched and learned, already aware that observation was safer than action. Ruth was assigned to help in the house. This pleased her. Houses were full of secrets. Fields were honest in their brutality, but houses lied. She worked steadily, carefully, never rushing, never appearing idle. She learned which objects mattered most to Margaret by watching which ones were dusted twice. She learned Elijah's moods by the way he set down his hat. She learned the children's fears by what they pretended not to notice. Within a week, Margaret trusted her with small tasks. Within a month, Ruth was present during moments the family forgot she was there. She was a shadow that moved when called and vanished when not needed. This was not invisibility, it was camouflage. One afternoon, while helping Margaret sort linens, Ruth overheard her mistress speaking to herself in a trembling voice. It was not meant for any ears but her own. "He never listens," Margaret whispered. "Not anymore." Ruth kept folding, her hands smooth and practiced. She did not react. People revealed their truths when they believed no one was listening. Interrupting such moments was a mistake. Margaret glanced at her, startled, then relaxed. "You're quiet, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am," Ruth said softly. Margaret nodded, as if confirming something she already believed. That night, Ruth marked it in her mind, the beginning of trust. Trust, she knew, was not given. It was constructed carefully, brick by brick, lie by lie, truth by truth. Over the following weeks, she allowed herself small imperfections. She broke a plate once and cried quietly over it, letting Margaret comfort her. She asked simple questions that flattered Elijah's sense of authority. She praised the children without making them self-conscious. Each action was chosen, weighed, measured. She never spoke of her past. People filled silence with assumptions, and assumptions were tools. The other enslaved workers noticed her position in the house and watched her carefully. Some resented her, some feared she would bring trouble. Ruth did not blame them. Survival bred suspicion. She did not seek friendships yet. Alliances formed too early could be dangerous. First, she needed leverage. It came sooner than expected. One evening, Elijah returned home in a foul mood. His boots were muddy, his jaw clenched. Ruth was pouring tea when Margaret asked about his day. He snapped at her, words sharp and humiliating, spoken without restraint. Margaret's face flushed, then went pale. She said nothing, but her hands shook. Ruth saw everything. Later that night, while clearing the study, she noticed a letter left open on the desk. She did not touch it. She did not need to. She caught enough words to understand its significance: money troubles, a loan denied, a reputation at risk, fear again. Thick and unmistakable. From that day on, Ruth adjusted her behavior subtly. She became more attentive to Margaret, more deferential to Elijah, more present without being intrusive. She allowed Margaret to speak, to complain in fragments, to vent frustrations disguised as casual remarks. She listened and remembered. Margaret began to confide in her without realizing it. A word here, a sigh there. Ruth responded only with sympathetic silence or carefully neutral phrases. Never advice. Advice created accountability. Elijah, too, grew accustomed to her presence. He noticed her efficiency, her lack of attitude, the way she never met his eyes too boldly. Men like Elijah mistook compliance for loyalty. The children trusted her quickest. Children always did. She told them stories, not of hope, but of clever animals who survived by thinking faster than those who hunted them. They listened, wide-eyed, absorbing lessons she pretended were entertainment. Weeks turned into months. The Mercers began to feel settled again, unaware that the balance they enjoyed was fragile. "Ruth can. You better." She could feel the tension beneath the surface, the unspoken resentments coiled like snakes waiting for warmth. One evening, as Margaret brushed her hair by the window, she spoke without looking at Ruth. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to live without fear?" Ruth paused just long enough to make the moment feel heavy. "I think everyone wonders that, ma'am." Margaret laughed softly, a broken sound. "Perhaps." That night Ruth lay awake and considered her position. She had information now. She had access. What she did not yet have was direction. She did not act out of anger or revenge. Those emotions burned too hot and left traces. She acted for control. The world had taught her a lesson early. Power was not always held by those who appeared to command it. Often, it belonged to those who understood how fragile command truly was. She did not hate the Mercers. Hate was noisy. She saw them as components in a larger mechanism, useful, flawed, predictable. Her plan was not fully formed yet, but its foundation was solid. She would not fight chains with chains. She would loosen the bolts quietly, one at a time, until the structure collapsed under its own weight. When she finally slept, it was not with peace, but with purpose. Georgia did not yet know her. The land had only just begun to feel her presence, like a hairline crack spreading through stone. In time, houses would fall. Her laugh was thin. And yet, the word hung in the air like smoke. Ruth folded another dress. The silence encouraged Margaret to continue. Silence always did. Meanwhile, Elijah's trust came differently. It was not built on emotional exposure but on utility. Ruth anticipated his needs before he voiced them. She kept his study immaculate, his papers organized just enough to feel orderly without questioning his authority. When he spoke, she listened attentively, but never offered opinions unless directly asked. And even then, she framed them as questions. "Would you like the lamp moved, sir? Shall I bring more ink?" Men like Elijah mistook attentiveness for respect. They never considered that attentiveness could be a weapon. Ruth noticed changes in his habits, the way he lingered longer over letters, the way he paced at night, the way his temper flared over insignificant things. Fear made people careless. Carelessness left traces. One evening, while clearing the dining table, she overheard Elijah speaking to a visitor in the study. The door was ajar. Elijah's voice was low but strained. "If word spreads, it could ruin me." The visitor murmured something Ruth could not hear. "I've managed things this far," Elijah snapped. "I don't need threats." Ruth did not pause. She did not look toward the door. She simply filed the tone, the tension, the phrasing away. She did not yet know what the secret was. She only needed to know it existed. Trust, she had learned, was not about being liked. It was about being relied upon. The children trusted her in simpler ways. Eliza followed her like a shadow, asking questions that sounded innocent but weren't. "Why do grown-ups lie?" Eliza asked one afternoon while Ruth braided her hair. Ruth considered her response carefully. "Sometimes they're afraid of the truth." "Does lying help?" "Only for a little while." Eliza frowned, absorbing this. "Then what happens?" Ruth's hands paused briefly. "Then the truth finds another way to be heard." Thomas, on the other hand, confided through frustration. He complained about his father's expectations, his mother's disappointment, the weight of being a son who never seemed enough. Ruth listened without judgment, offering only small comforts. Food slipped his way, praise for effort rather than success. Children grew loyal quickly when they felt understood. Outside the house, Ruth remained careful. She spoke little to the other enslaved workers, never boasting of her position, never offering information. She understood how quickly resentment could become danger. Still, eyes followed her. Whispers circulated. "She thinks she's better. She's too quiet." Ruth ignored it. Survival demanded patience. What she did not ignore were patterns. Margaret argued with Elijah most often after receiving letters. Elijah drank more after trips to town. Thomas's punishments increased when Elijah felt powerless elsewhere. Eliza withdrew during those times, watching more closely, saying less. Ruth began to test small things, not lies, yet, but omissions. She delayed messages by minutes. She delivered them in slightly altered tones, not changing facts, only emphasis. A sigh added, a phrase softened, a concern amplified. The results were immediate and subtle. Margaret misinterpreted Elijah's silence as dismissal. Elijah perceived Margaret's questions as accusations. Neither realized how easily their communication fractured. Ruth observed, adjusted, refined. One afternoon, Margaret asked Ruth to sit for a moment while she rested. This alone marked a shift. Enslaved women were not invited to sit. "You're good at listening," Margaret said quietly. Ruth inclined her head. "I listen because you speak, ma'am." Margaret smiled faintly. "Do you ever judge me?" The question surprised Ruth, but she masked it well. "No, ma'am." Margaret laughed softly. "I envy that." That night, Ruth recognized the danger. Trust had ripened into dependence. Margaret was beginning to see her not as a servant but as a witness. Witnesses were powerful. Elijah, too, crossed a line soon after. He began leaving his study door unlocked when Ruth worked nearby. He spoke freely in her presence, venting frustrations about business partners, debts, rivals. He assumed she did not understand, or that understanding did not matter. Men like Elijah never imagined their downfall could be overheard while they spoke. Ruth did not rush her plans. She knew destruction required timing. Rushing only revealed the hand behind the action. Instead, she strengthened her position. She made herself indispensable. When Margaret fell ill, Ruth tended to her tirelessly. When Elijah misplaced documents, Ruth found them. When the children feared punishment, Ruth intervened gently, redirecting anger elsewhere. Each act wove another thread of reliance. By the end of the season, the Mercers could not imagine the house without her, and that was when Ruth finally allowed herself to plant the first true seed. It was small, almost harmless. Margaret had been awaiting a letter from her sister for weeks. Ruth knew this because Margaret mentioned it often. When the letter finally arrived, Ruth noticed immediately. Thin envelope, familiar hand. She did not open it. She did not read it. She simply set it aside. Not hidden. Just delayed. 2 days passed. Margaret grew anxious. She wondered aloud if something was wrong. Elijah dismissed her concerns sharply. When Ruth finally delivered the letter, Margaret was already upset. Her emotional state colored her reading. A neutral sentence felt cold. A delayed response felt intentional. "Why didn't she write sooner?" Margaret asked, wounded. Ruth lowered her gaze. "Perhaps she was busy, ma'am." Perhaps that word did the work Ruth never had to. The house felt different after that. Tighter. Edgier. Conversations grew shorter. Assumptions replaced explanations. Ruth watched it all, calm and precise. She was no longer merely listening. She was shaping. At night, lying in her narrow bed, she did not feel triumph. Only clarity. She understood now how easily people unraveled when guided gently toward their own fears. The Mercers believed their troubles came from outside pressures, from money, from society, from each other. They never considered the quiet woman who moved through their lives like a shadow, adjusting nothing but perception. And Ruth knew this was only the beginning. Trust had been earned. Soon it would be used. By the time the first family began to fracture beyond repair, Ruth had already stepped so far inside their lives that no one remembered a moment before her presence. That, she knew, was the final threshold. When people forgot when you arrived, they also forgot to question why you were there. The Mercer household entered its decline quietly, the way rot enters a beam, unnoticed until weight is applied. Margaret became restless. She slept poorly, woke with headaches, forgot things she had never forgotten before. She blamed herself at first, then Elijah. Elijah, sensing accusation where none was spoken, hardened. He withdrew into silence, then lashed out without warning. Their conversations no longer flowed, they collided. Each believed the other had changed. Ruth did not create their fears. She only rearranged them. She began with tone. When Margaret asked a question, Ruth answered gently but with a pause that suggested uncertainty. When Elijah gave instructions, Ruth obeyed perfectly but delivered updates with careful restraint. She never lied outright. Lies could be traced. Instead, she offered incomplete truths. "The master seemed troubled today," she would say, not specifying why. "Miss Margaret looked upset earlier," she would mention, without explanation. People filled gaps with imagination. Imagination was far more destructive than fact. Margaret began to interpret Elijah's moods as deliberate coldness. She replayed his words in her mind night, hearing insults where none had been intended. Ruth noticed the way Margaret lingered near the windows now, staring out as if looking for something beyond the property lines. Elijah, meanwhile, noticed changes too. Margaret questioned him more often. Her tone sharpened. Her silences grew heavier. He began to suspect she doubted his authority, perhaps even his fidelity. Suspicion, once planted, grew quickly in men like Elijah. Pride watered it daily. Ruth watched their arguments escalate, careful never to be present when voices rose too high. Absence during conflict made her presence afterward feel like relief. The children felt it next. Thomas grew sullen and angry. His punishments increased, often for small mistakes. He blamed his mother. Eliza withdrew completely, becoming watchful, quiet even by her own standards. She noticed Ruth's role long before the adults did, though she did not yet understand it. One afternoon, while Ruth helped Eliza with her sewing, the girl asked softly, "Why don't they talk like they used to?" Ruth chose her words with precision. "Sometimes grown-ups believe they're protecting each other by staying quiet." Eliza frowned. "It doesn't feel like protection." "No," Ruth agreed, "it rarely does." The girl studied her, eyes sharp. "You notice everything." Ruth met her gaze for the first time fully. "So do you." Something passed between them then, recognition perhaps, or warning. The first real break came with a letter. Elijah received correspondence from a business partner in Savannah. Ruth was the one who brought it to him, noticing immediately the way his hands trembled as he read. His face darkened. He folded the letter slowly, deliberately, as if controlling his temper by force of will. That night, he drank more than usual. Margaret asked about the letter. Elijah dismissed her questions curtly, too curtly. Margaret, already raw with doubt, pressed harder. Voices rose. Ruth slipped quietly from the room, leaving the argument to ferment. The next morning, Ruth mentioned, casually, almost apologetically, that she had seen Elijah burning papers late into the night. "I hope I wasn't mistaken," she said softly to Margaret. "The fire was low." Margaret's face went pale. "Burning papers?" Ruth lowered her eyes. "I'm sure it was nothing important, ma'am." But it was already too late. Margaret's imagination supplied the rest. Secrets, debts, affairs, plans she was not meant to know. She confronted Elijah again, this time with bitterness instead of confusion. Elijah, feeling cornered, responded with cruelty. He accused her of spying, of mistrust, of ingratitude. Words once spoken could not be reclaimed. The house fell into silence afterward, a thick, suffocating quiet that pressed against the walls. Ruth moved through it efficiently, careful not to disturb the tension. She spoke only when spoken to. She made herself useful, soothing, neutral. To both sides she appeared loyal. That was when she began the second maneuver. She allowed Margaret to believe Ruth was the only one who understood her. Margaret spoke more freely now, her resentment spilling out in fragments, complaints about Elijah's temper, his secrecy, his disregard. Ruth responded with sympathetic murmurs, never validating, never contradicting. Her neutrality made Margaret feel heard without feeling judged. Elijah, too, leaned on Ruth unknowingly. He complained about Margaret's mood, her questions, her lack of gratitude. Ruth listened respectfully, offering no opinions, only understanding. Each believed Ruth was on their side. Ruth never suggested action. She only reflected emotion. "It sounds difficult, sir. That must be very painful, ma'am." Those phrases did more damage than any accusation. The breaking point came during a dinner meant to impress guests. Elijah had invited another prominent family to dine, men whose approval mattered to him. Margaret was already anxious, aware that any misstep would reflect poorly on her. Ruth noticed Margaret's hands shaking as she prepared. During the meal, Elijah drank too much. He spoke too loudly, laughed too sharply. Margaret corrected him once, just once, over a detail about business. Elijah's smile tightened. His response was sharp, humiliating. The guests fell silent. Margaret's face flushed with shame. Ruth stood at the edge of the room, eyes lowered, absorbing everything. Later that night, after the guests had gone, the argument exploded. Margaret accused Elijah of embarrassing her intentionally. Elijah accused her of undermining him publicly. Years of unspoken resentment poured out in words meant to wound. Ruth heard glass break. She did not intervene. The next morning, Margaret did not come down for breakfast. Elijah sent Ruth to check on her. Ruth found Margaret sitting rigidly on the edge of the bed, eyes red but dry. "He despises me," Margaret whispered. Ruth hesitated, just enough. "I don't think he knows how to listen anymore, ma'am." That sentence settled into Margaret like poison disguised as medicine. Margaret stopped trying after that. She became distant, cold, deliberate. Elijah interpreted her withdrawal as contempt. He responded with harsher discipline toward the children. Longer absences, more drinking. The household fractured further, each member retreating into isolation. Ruth watched it all with careful detachment. The final push came not from Ruth's actions, but from Elijah's desperation. His financial troubles deepened. Rumors began circulating in town, missed payments, questionable dealings. One evening, a man arrived unexpectedly, demanding to speak with Elijah privately. Voices carried through the walls. "You promised, you assured me." Ruth stood nearby, pretending to clean. The next day, Elijah accused Margaret of spreading rumors. Margaret denied it furiously. The accusation cut deep. Trust shattered completely. Margaret packed a small bag that night. "I can't stay here," she told Ruth, voice trembling. "I won't be humiliated further." Ruth said nothing, only helped her fold clothes with gentle efficiency. Margaret left for her sister's home without telling Elijah. The scandal was immediate. Elijah's reputation suffered. Whispers followed him in town. His household, once orderly, now looked unstable. Business partners withdrew. Credit vanished. His temper worsened. The children suffered. Within months, Elijah was forced to sell property, then livestock, then people. Ruth watched calmly as the family she had entered so quietly began to dissolve. She was sold shortly after Margaret's departure. Elijah did not look at her when the transaction was made. To him, she was just another asset to liquidate, another consequence of misfortune. He never suspected her involvement. He could not imagine that his downfall had begun with a woman he barely noticed. As Ruth was led away, she glanced once at the house. It looked smaller now, weaker, like a structure already hollowed out from within. The Mercers believed their family had been destroyed by money, pride, and misunderstanding. They were not wrong. They were simply incomplete. Ruth stepped into the next chapter of her life with no fear, only calculation. She had tested her method. It worked, and somewhere behind her, a once powerful family learned too late that destruction did not always arrive with fire and chains. Sometimes it arrived quietly, carrying a tray, listening and waiting. Ruth learned the price placed on her body before she ever learned the name of the man who bought her. She stood on a platform in the heat, hands folded, eyes lowered, listening as men discussed her the way they discussed horses: age, strength, temperament. Someone remarked that she was well behaved. Another said she looked clever but not troublesome. Ruth understood the value of that reputation. It followed her like a shadow, and she allowed it to. When the bidding ended, she belonged to Samuel Dupaway. Whitlow owned a smaller plantation than the Mercers, but it was newer, built on ambition rather than inheritance. Where Elijah Mercer had been careful and fearful of scandal, Samuel Whitlow was hungry. Hunger made men reckless. Ruth recognized it immediately. Whitlow's house was louder, messier, filled with sharp laughter and sharper tempers. His wife, Clarissa, met Ruth with a long, assessing stare that lingered too long to be polite. "She's quiet," Whitlow said approvingly. "Just what we need." Clarissa said nothing. Her silence was thick, suspicious. Ruth marked it. The Whitlows had no children, though Clarissa spoke often of wanting them. Samuel avoided the subject. That absence sat between them like a third presence, resentful, unspoken, dangerous. Ruth was placed inside the house again. She had expected this. Men who valued appearances always kept their most useful tools close. From the first day, she adjusted herself. She spoke less than she had with the Mercers. New household, new rhythm. She moved carefully, observing Clarissa's habits, Samuel's moods, the spaces where arguments lived even when voices did not rise. Clarissa Whitlow was different from Margaret Mercer. Where Margaret had been fragile, Clarissa was sharp-edged, defensive, always braced for disappointment. She watched Ruth closely, testing, waiting for mistakes. Ruth made none. She learned quickly that Clarissa felt isolated. The Whitlow plantation sat farther from town, and Clarissa's social circle was thin. She had no sisters nearby, no children to occupy her time. Her world revolved around Samuel, and Samuel was often absent, physically or emotionally. Loneliness, Ruth knew, was fertile ground. Samuel's trust came easily. He liked efficiency and obedience. He liked being admired. Ruth offered neither openly, but she gave him something better: confirmation. She nodded when he spoke of his plans. She listened when he complained of rivals. She never contradicted him. Clarissa, however, remained wary. "You worked for the Mercers," Clarissa said one afternoon while Ruth arranged flowers. "Yes, ma'am." "They had trouble, didn't they?" Ruth paused just enough. "I don't know, ma'am. I was sold before I understood much." Clarissa studied her face. Ruth kept it smooth, unreadable. Clarissa said. "Funny how trouble follows some people." Ruth bowed her head. "Yes, ma'am." Clarissa did not trust her. That, Ruth realized, would require patience. She let time do the work. Weeks passed. Clarissa observed Ruth's consistency, her lack of attitude, her usefulness. Ruth learned Clarissa's insecurities, her fear of aging, her resentment toward younger women in town, her growing suspicion that Samuel blamed her for their childlessness. One night, after Samuel returned late smelling of liquor and sweat, Clarissa cried quietly in her room. Ruth heard it while passing and paused just long enough to make her presence known. Clarissa wiped her face quickly when she saw her. "You may leave." "Yes, ma'am." But the seed had been planted. Clarissa began speaking to Ruth soon after, not directly, not confessional, but in complaints disguised as observations. "He works too much. Men don't understand what women endure. It's exhausting, always pretending everything is fine." Ruth responded with sympathetic silence, occasional murmurs. Never agreement, never denial. Meanwhile, Samuel began relying on Ruth more heavily. He trusted her with letters, messages, errands. He spoke openly in her presence, complaining about Clarissa's moods, her coldness, her failure to be what he expected. "She looks at me like I've already disappointed her," he said once, slamming a glass onto the table, "as if it's all my fault." Ruth listened. She remembered. Slowly, carefully, she altered herself. She changed her posture slightly around Clarissa. More deferential, softer. Around Samuel, she became brisk, efficient. She allowed each of them to see a different. version of her, each tailored to their needs. Then she introduced friction. Clarissa once asked whether Samuel had returned early from town. Ruth answered truthfully, but with emphasis, "He came back late, ma'am, later than usual." Clarissa's jaw tightened. "Did he say where he'd been?" "No, ma'am." Which was also true. Another time Samuel asked whether Clarissa had seemed upset that morning. Ruth hesitated. "She was quiet, sir." Quiet. The word carried weight. Soon Clarissa began checking Samuel's clothes for unfamiliar scents. Samuel noticed her scrutiny, and grew defensive. Small arguments erupted. They accused each other of moods, of suspicion, of disrespect. Ruth remained steady, neutral, indispensable. Then came the visitor. A young woman arrived one afternoon. Samuel's cousin, he said, though Clarissa's reaction suggested surprise. The woman was lively, flirtatious, careless with boundaries. She laughed too loudly at Samuel's jokes. Clarissa watched from across the room, rigid. Ruth noticed everything. She made no overt move. Instead, she allowed Clarissa to notice Samuel's attention linger. She allowed Samuel to notice Clarissa's coldness. After the visitor left, the argument was explosive. "You embarrassed me," Clarissa hissed. "You imagine insults everywhere," Samuel snapped. Ruth stayed out of sight, listening. That night Clarissa did not sleep beside Samuel. The next morning Ruth found Clarissa pacing the room, hands clenched. "Men humiliate women and call it charm," Clarissa said bitterly. Ruth folded laundry slowly. "Some do, ma'am." That was the closest Ruth ever came to agreement. Clarissa's trust shifted after that. She began confiding more openly, her resentment spilling out unchecked. Ruth listened, absorbing Clarissa's growing paranoia, her jealousy, her fear of abandonment. Samuel, meanwhile, grew resentful of Clarissa's distance. He spent more time away from the house, drinking, meeting with associates, avoiding confrontation. Rumors began circulating, nothing concrete, just whispers. Ruth never spread them. She only acknowledged them when Clarissa brought them up. "I heard something in town," Clarissa said one evening, voice trembling. "Something about Samuel." Ruth looked surprised. "I hadn't heard, ma'am." Clarissa searched her face. "Do you think they're lying?" Ruth paused. "People say many things." Clarissa's imagination did the rest. The final fracture came suddenly. Samuel lost a significant investment. The money was gone. The partner vanished. Samuel came home furious, humiliated. Clarissa confronted him about his absences, his secrets. He exploded. He accused her of poisoning his reputation with her bitterness. She accused him of infidelity. He struck the wall beside her head. Not her, but close enough. The line was crossed. Clarissa fled to a neighbor's home that night. The scandal spread quickly. Samuel's business partners withdrew. Clarissa refused to return unless conditions were met. Samuel refused to apologize. Pride calcified into ruin. Within weeks, Samuel was forced to sell assets to cover debts, including Ruth. Clarissa watched as Ruth was led away. "You," Clarissa said suddenly, stepping forward. "You saw everything." Ruth lowered her head. "Yes, ma'am." Clarissa studied her, something dawning in her eyes, too late to matter. "Did you ever lie to me?" Clarissa asked. Ruth met her gaze calmly. "No, ma'am." It was true, Clarissa said nothing more. Ruth was sold again, this time to a family with connections, beyond the plantation. Neighbors, cousins, friends. A network. As she walked away from the Whitlow house, Ruth reflected without emotion. 2 families now lay in pieces behind her. Not because she had struck them down, but because she had given their fears room to breathe. She understood now that her power traveled with her. It did not depend on place or people. It depended on pattern. She would adapt. She always did. Georgia was fou. LL of families who believed themselves secure. Ruth adjusted her grip on the small bundle she carried and stepped forward. Already listening, already learning, already preparing. The work was becoming easier, and the consequences were growing larger. Families were only nodes, interconnected points bound by pride, obligation, fear, and reputation. Destroy one in isolation and the damage was contained. Disrupt the connections between them, and the collapse spread outward like a sickness no one could trace to its source. The plantation she was sold into belonged to the Caldwell family, one of the oldest names in the county. Unlike the Mercers or the Whitlows, the Caldwells were not defined by a single household. They were a web. Cousins married to cousins, debts shared across generations. Favors traded quietly over decades. Their power lay not in money alone, but in mutual protection. Ruth recognized the danger immediately. This family would not fall from internal fracture alone. It would require something more delicate. She arrived as a replacement, an unremarkable purchase meant to fill a vacancy left by illness. That worked in her favor. Expectations were low. Attention was scattered. The head of the household was Judge Henry Caldwell, a man whose authority extended beyond his land into the courtroom and the town council. His wife, Eleanor, managed the house with cool precision. Their marriage was not warm, but it was stable, built on shared interest rather than affection. Stability, Ruth knew, was the hardest thing to undermine. Their adult son, Nathaniel, lived nearby with his young wife, Rebecca. Their daughter, Lydia, was recently engaged to a man from another prominent family, the Harpers. Every relationship overlapped, every slight carried consequences. Ruth was placed where she had hoped, inside the main house, close to information, close to movement. She took her time learning the terrain. The Caldwells were careful people. They spoke softly, guardedly, especially around those they considered invisible. Ruth became very invisible. She learned quickly that Eleanor Caldwell valued control above all else. She ran the household like a ledger, everything accounted for, nothing left to chance. Ruth mirrored this efficiency, anticipating needs before they were voiced. Eleanor approved without warmth, but approval was not what Ruth sought. It was access. Judge Caldwell was different. Wanted independence but feared alienation. He borrowed money discreetly. He made promises he could not keep. Ruth began to see the shape of the system. She did not rush. Her first move was subtle. She altered the flow of information. A message meant for Eleanor arrived late. A comment from Judge Caldwell reached Lydia with just enough change in tone to sting. A remark made by a Harper was repeated to a Caldwell cousin, not as gossip but as concern. "I thought you should know," Ruth would say softly when she spoke at all. She never named motives. She let others assign them. Tension grew. Eleanor grew sharper with Rebecca, convinced the young woman was careless, perhaps even untrustworthy. Rebecca grew defensive, confiding more in Ruth, interpreting every correction as hostility. Lydia's engagement soured under strain. She felt slighted by the Harpers' growing boldness. The Harpers, in turn, felt insulted by Caldwell arrogance. Judge Caldwell noticed shifts but misjudged their source. He believed he could manage everything through authority. Authority, Ruth knew, was brittle. The true fracture began with money. Nathaniel's debts caught up with him. A lender, connected to the Harpers, demanded repayment publicly. The embarrassment was swift and merciless. Judge Caldwell intervened, but the damage was done. Whispers spread. Alliances strained. Ruth did nothing dramatic. She merely observed and adjusted. She let Rebecca overhear a conversation she was never meant to hear, Eleanor questioning her character. She let Eleanor hear that Rebecca had been seen speaking privately with someone from the Harpers. Both were true. Both were harmless. Together they became explosive. Rebecca confronted Nathaniel. Nathaniel denied wrongdoing but grew angry at the implication. Their marriage strained. Meanwhile, Lydia's engagement unraveled. The Harpers accused the Caldwells of manipulation. The Caldwells accused the Harpers of ingratitude. Judge Caldwell, insulted, withdrew support from a legal matter involving the Harpers. That single act triggered consequences far beyond the household. Lawsuits followed. Business partnerships dissolved. Invitations stopped arriving. The county noticed. Ruth felt the shift like a change in weather. The Caldwells were no longer untouchable. She pressed gently. She allowed a letter to be misfiled, not hidden, just delayed, until its contents arrived too late to prevent offense. She answered questions truthfully but incompletely. She mirrored emotions without directing them. People began acting on assumptions. Rebecca, isolated and fearful, made a mistake. She confided in the wrong person. Her words reached Eleanor, distorted and sharpened. Eleanor confronted her coldly, publicly. Rebecca fled the house in humiliation. Nathaniel chose his wife over his parents. The family split. Judge Caldwell's authority weakened. Rivals sensed opportunity. Old grudges resurfaced. His rulings were questioned. His impartiality doubted. Within a year, the Caldwell name lost its quiet dominance. Not ruined entirely, but diminished, fractured, vulnerable. Ruth was sold again before the worst of it settled. Eleanor claimed she disrupted harmony. Judge Caldwell agreed, eager to excise what he perceived as an element of disorder. Neither understood how thoroughly the disorder had already taken root. As Ruth was led away, she felt no satisfaction, only confirmation. The pattern held. Families did not fall because of lies alone, they fell because of pride, fear, and the refusal to listen to one another. She simply learned how to loosen those threads. And now, she had moved beyond households. She had learned how to turn families against families. Georgia, she knew, was small in this way. Everyone was connected. Every collapse weakened the next. The myth had not yet formed, but its shape was emerging. Where Ruth went, things unraveled, and soon people would begin to notice. Not her, but the wake she left behind. Things moved on their own now. She felt it first in the way people hesitated before purchasing her, in the glances exchanged between buyers, in the lowered voices that followed her name. No one could explain why, only that trouble seemed to gather wherever she settled, like clouds drawn to heat. They did not call her dangerous. They called her unlucky. That was better. She was sold to the Wainwrights, a family not particularly powerful on their own but deeply entangled with others, through marriages, shared debts, shared secrets. If the Caldwells had been a web, the Wainwrights were a knot at its center. The plantation sat near a crossroads, a place where news passed quickly and rarely unchanged. Ruth recognized the opportunity immediately. Mrs. Agnes Wainwright ran the house with brittle cheer, the kind that cracked under pressure. Her husband, Charles, was charming in public and cutting in private. Their marriage survived on appearances alone, stitched together by the fear of scandal. They hosted often. Ruth was placed inside the house again, this time with almost no scrutiny. Agnes wanted a servant who blended into the background. Charles wanted one who did not speak. Ruth obliged both. The guests were the real attraction: politicians, landowners, relatives from neighboring counties, people who spoke freely after wine loosened their caution. Ruth learned names, rivalries, grudges. She learned who owed whom, who despised whom politely, who smiled while calculating advantage. For the first time, she was not dealing with families in isolation. She was dealing with a community. Agnes Wainwright trusted Ruth quickly, not emotionally but logistically. She relied on her to manage dinners, guest rooms, schedules. Ruth knew who stayed where, who spoke privately with whom, who avoided eye contact at breakfast. Charles trusted Ruth differently. He barely registered her presence, which allowed him to speak openly. He flirted carelessly with women who were not his wife. He complained loudly about allies he still needed. Men like Charles believed servants were furniture. Ruth furnished herself accordingly. She did not invent rumors. That would have been crude. She merely adjusted their timing. A comment overheard one evening would reach the right ears days later, softened just enough to sound accidental. A concern voiced privately would surface publicly, stripped of context. A suspicion would be confirmed not by words but by silence. People began to misinterpret one another. A visiting cousin felt insulted when an invitation did not arrive, never knowing it had been delayed. A business partner took offense at a perceived slight. A woman noticed her husband being watched and assumed the worst. Agnes began to feel it first. "People are cold lately," she said one morning, stirring her tea too hard. "Do you feel it?" Ruth nodded once. "They seem distracted." That was enough. Agnes began questioning conversations, replaying interactions. Charles dismissed her concerns. Agnes interpreted dismissal as disrespect. Their private arguments intensified. Meanwhile, guests began leaving earlier than usual. Invitations slowed. Whispers replaced laughter. The Wainwrights' position weakened subtly, socially. Ruth noticed something else too. Servants talked, not to her, but around her. They whispered about her presence in previous households, about families ruined, alliances broken, fortunes diminished. She was with the Mercers, and the Whitlows, and the Caldwells too. The pattern became harder to ignore. Ruth did nothing to stop the whispers. Fear, once loose, traveled faster than truth. Soon households began blaming unseen forces: bad luck, curses, envy. Never her. That was when the myth began. Not a story with details, a feeling, a superstition. If she comes here, things go wrong. The Wainwrights' collapse was faster than the others. Charles's affairs became public knowledge, not because Ruth exposed them, but because Agnes stopped covering for him. Agnes confided in the wrong friend. That friend repeated her words, sharpened by envy. Charles retaliated by humiliating Agnes publicly. The community took sides. Business partners withdrew quietly. Invitations stopped entirely. The Wainwrights became isolated. When Charles's finances faltered soon after, no one stepped in to help. Ruth was sold again, quickly, almost urgently. Agnes would not look at her. "I don't know what it is about you," Agnes said finally, voice tight, "but things were better before you arrived." Ruth lowered her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Agnes shuddered. By the time Ruth left, the Wainwright name was already fading, and now people were watching. Her next buyer hesitated before finalizing the purchase. "You won't bring trouble, will you?" he asked, half joking. Ruth looked confused. "No, sir." The man laughed nervously. Trouble had begun to follow her reputation instead of her actions. That was new. And dangerous, she adjusted. Her next household was modest, unimportant by design. A farmer with few connections. A wife too tired to gossip. A life that offered no leverage. Ruth accepted it calmly. For months, nothing happened. No arguments. No fractures. No scandals. People relaxed. The superstition weakened. Then she moved again, this time into a household tied to 3 others through marriage, and the pattern resumed. This time, Ruth did almost nothing. She did not delay letters. She did not reframe comments. She did not whisper concern. She merely existed. The family, aware of her reputation now, grew tense. They watched one another. They overinterpreted. They guarded words. Fear did the work for her. A son accused a cousin of betrayal. A wife suspected her husband of secrecy. A brother withheld support out of caution. The collapse that followed was messier than before, and for the first time, Ruth felt something change inside her. This was no longer control. This was momentum. She had become a catalyst. She was sold again. This time not because of any specific incident, but because people felt safer without her. That knowledge settled heavily. In her next household, the master refused to keep her inside the house. He assigned her to outdoor work, limiting her access. Wise, but fear does not require proximity. The other enslaved workers avoided her. Some crossed themselves when she passed. Some whispered prayers. Some refused to speak at all. Ruth realized then that she was becoming something else, not invisible, not trusted, but feared. Fear changed the rules. People stopped confiding, stopped speaking freely, stopped making mistakes in front of her. Her method faltered. For the first time since Georgia, Ruth felt constrained. She lay awake at night, listening not to others, but to herself. She had never intended this. She had acted to survive. "You late anymore," she advised, quietly, precisely. Families collapsed faster now, cleaner. No chaos. No scandal. Just shifts in loyalty, misaligned timing, pressure applied at weak points. Ruth became a tool wielded knowingly. That scared her more than superstition ever had, because now destruction had intent, and intent carried consequence. One night, after leaving yet another household fractured beyond repair, Ruth asked Holloway a question she had never voiced before. "What happens when there's nothing left to break?" Holloway smiled thinly. "Then people start looking for the one who taught them how." Ruth understood then. The myth was complete, not of a cursed woman, but of a quiet presence that turned strength inward until it collapsed, and myths always demanded an ending. She did not yet know whether hers would be disappearance or reckoning, but Georgia was running out of families willing to pretend they were immune, and Ruth, for the first time, wondered whether survival had finally begun to resemble a trap. Power was never satisfied with usefulness. It always wanted sacrifice. The family Holloway chose this time was not merely prominent, they were protected. The Graysons had survived wars, epidemics, financial panics, and political purges without losing their standing. Their name carried weight beyond county lines. Judges deferred to them. Banks bent rules for them. Newspapers softened language when writing about them. If the Caldwells had been a web, the Graysons were a fortress. "They won't fall," Holloway said calmly as the carriage rolled toward the estate. "But they'll fracture, and fractures are enough." Ruth watched the iron gates swing open. Stone lions guarded the entrance, worn smooth by time. Wealth like this did not panic easily. That was what made it dangerous. The head of the household was Augustus Grayson, old, immaculately composed, and deeply strategic. He had built his power by outlasting opponents rather than confronting them. His wife, Viola, was sharp-minded and socially lethal, a woman whose approval could make or break reputations. Their children were grown, each occupying a role in the family machine. Edward, the eldest, managed finances. Samuel, the middle son, handled politics. Clara, the youngest, maintained alliances through marriage and charity. They were not a family, they were an institution. Ruth was placed as a general house servant, nothing special, nothing close. Augustus insisted on distance. Ruth hesitated. She had crossed many lines before, but this family, this institution, did not deserve to be dismantled casually. The damage would not stop with them. It would ripple outward. Workers, dependents, smaller families protected by their shadow. Holloway saw her hesitation and misunderstood it. "You're afraid?" he asked. Ruth shook her head. "I'm careful." Carefulness annoyed men like Holloway. "Institutions survive because people believe they must," he said. "Break the belief." Ruth returned to the house with a weight in her chest she had not felt before. She began minimally. She let Viola overhear Edward questioning Augustus's judgment, not falsely but privately out of context. She let Samuel hear that Clara's husband had expressed doubts about the family's future. She let Clara see Viola correcting her publicly in ways that felt intentional. None of it was new. It was merely revealed. The Graysons reacted differently than others had. They did not implode emotionally. They strategized. Augustus tightened control. Edward became more guarded. Samuel grew more ambitious. Viola sharpened her social defenses. They began working against one another while maintaining a flawless exterior. That was worse. Ruth realized then that destruction did not always look like collapse. Sometimes it looked like survival at any cost. The first real casualty was Edward. Under pressure to secure funds and prove loyalty, he took a risk, quietly shifting assets in ways that skirted legality. Ruth did not expose it. Holloway did. Edward was forced out, not publicly ruined but erased. Sent away, written off. The family framed it as a health issue. Ruth watched Edward leave, pale and silent, and felt something inside her harden. The second casualty was Clara's marriage. Viola intervened for appearances, encouraging Clara to distance herself from her husband until uncertainty passed. The husband interpreted this as rejection and withdrew support. Clara obeyed. Her marriage never recovered. Samuel benefited. He stepped forward, filled gaps, gained influence. He began making decisions Augustus once controlled. The power shift was subtle but real. Augustus noticed. For the first time, Ruth saw uncertainty in the old man's eyes. The fortress was still standing, but it was hollowing. Then Holloway pushed too far. He demanded proof, something undeniable, something irreversible. Ruth refused. "This family doesn't fall the way others do," she said quietly. "If we force it, it won't be clean." Holloway smiled thinly. "Clean isn't the goal." That night, Ruth made her decision. She stopped helping. She did not warn Holloway. She did not sabotage him. She simply stepped aside. She stopped adjusting timing, stopped shaping perception, stopped guiding conversations. She watched. Without her subtle balance, Holloway misjudged the Graysons. He moved too openly, pressed too hard, applied pressure where patience was required. The Graysons noticed. Augustus connected patterns, not superstition, not coincidence, strategy. Holloway vanished within a week. No arrest, no body, just absence. The message was clear. Ruth expected to follow. Instead, Augustus summoned her. She stood before him in his study, aware that this was the first time he had ever addressed her directly. "You've been here a long time," he said calmly. "Longer than most." "Yes, sir." "You observe." "Yes, sir." He studied her. "You understand systems." Ruth said nothing. Augustus nodded slowly. "That makes you dangerous." She waited. "But also valuable." "That was worse. You could have ruined us," he continued. "You didn't." Ruth met his gaze. "I didn't want to." Augustus believed her. He leaned back. "You will leave this house quietly. Tonight, with payment, with protection, and with the understanding that if your name ever appears near ours again, you will not vanish as Holloway did." Ruth bowed her head. "I understand." As she walked away from the Grayson estate, she felt something she had not felt in years: relief. She had survived power with limits. But survival no longer felt like victory. The myth would continue without Holloway, without her. People would keep fearing patterns, interpreting coincidence, acting on paranoia. She had taught them how. That knowledge followed her as she disappeared into the countryside, leaving behind no record, no trail, only fractured families, and one institution that had nearly fallen, but learned instead how close it had come. Ruth did not know where she was going, only that she could never again belong to any system that required destruction to justify itself. Part 8 would not be about collapse. It would be about disappearance, and whether a woman who had become a myth could ever return to being human again. She left Georgia without ceremony, without witnesses who shows up in records. No farewell, no chase, no dramatic break, just a woman moving at dawn, carrying little more than memory and consequence. That was how she had learned to survive, by slipping between moments when no one thought to look. For the first time in years, Ruth was not being sold. She was released, not free in any legal sense, not protected by papers or promises, but unclaimed, untracked, untethered to any household or name that could be used to summon her back. That kind of freedom was dangerous. Outside the structure of plantations and families, the world did not offer roles. It demanded invention. Ruth walked roads where no one knew her story, where superstition had not yet reached, where her reputation had no shape. At first, she expected relief to feel lighter. Instead, it felt hollow. She stayed briefly with small communities, farms too poor to traffic in power, households too busy surviving to unravel one another. In these places, her skills meant little. People spoke plainly, fights were loud and direct, secrets were crude, easy to see, rarely worth exploiting. No leverage, no patterns, just hunger, exhaustion, and weather. Ruth worked. She cooked, she cleaned, she labored in fields beside others who did not whisper about her or avert their eyes. Some treated her kindly, some did not. None feared her. It should have been enough. It wasn't. At night she lay awake listening, waiting for tensions that never came. Her mind still mapped conversations, traced motives, anticipated fractures, but there was nothing to pull apart. She had spent so long sharpening herself into a tool that she no longer knew how to be dull. The myth followed anyway, not loudly, not completely, but enough. A farmer's wife once said, half joking, "You don't bring trouble with you, do you?" A man crossed himself quietly when she passed. A rumor reached her that a woman like her had ruined families down south. Ruth learned then that disappearance did not erase impact, it only blurred it. Months passed. Then years. She aged quietly, lines forming at the corners of her eyes, strength settling deeper into her bones. She moved farther from Georgia, farther from the web she had helped tear apart. She changed names when necessary. Ruth became Ruthie. Became nothing at all. Sometimes she almost believed she was safe, until the past found her. It came not in chains or threats, but in recognition. A man approached her in a market one afternoon, older, heavier, but unmistakable. Edward Grayson, the one erased. He stared at her as if seeing a ghost. "You," he said softly. Ruth did not deny it. Denial invited pursuit. "Yes." He laughed once bitterly. "I wondered if you were real." They spoke briefly, carefully. Edward told her what she already suspected. The Graysons had survived, but they were no longer unified. Augustus died within the year. Samuel ruled what remained. Clara lived distant and childless. The institution endured, but brittle, paranoid, always watching for internal collapse. "You changed how they thin," Edward said. "They trust no one now." Ruth felt no pride in that. Edward studied her. "You could have finished us." "I didn't want to," she replied. "I know," he said. "That's why you lived." Edward left without asking where she was going or what she planned to do. He did not need answers. Seeing her had been enough. The encounter unsettled her more than any threat ever had, because it confirmed what she feared. She could leave systems, but systems would remember her. In the years that followed, Ruth made a deliberate choice. She stopped listening the way she once had. When people spoke, she let words pass without dissection. When conflicts arose, she stepped away instead of closer. When she felt the familiar itch to adjust perception, she resisted it. It was harder than she expected. Control had once been survival. Now it was temptation. The true reckoning came unexpectedly. A young woman sought her out one evening, desperate, shaking, on the edge of ruin. She spoke of a household filled with cruelty, of power wielded without mercy, of secrets that could destroy everyone involved. "You know how to handle people like that," the woman whispered. "They say you're dangerous." Ruth listened, and for the first time in decades she told the truth plainly. "Yes," she said, "I know how to break them." The woman's eyes filled with hope. "And it will cost you more than you think," Ruth continued. "It won't stop with them. It never does." The woman hesitated. "Then what should I do?" Ruth considered her answer carefully. "Leave," she said. "Live. Let the system starve without you." The woman did not look satisfied. She wanted destruction, validation, justice shaped like collapse. Ruth could not give it to her. That night Ruth understood the final shape of her story. She had not been cunning because she enjoyed it. She had been cunning because the world rewarded silence, perception, and indirect power to those denied everything else. Her cruelty had been adaptive, but adaptation was not destiny. In the end, the most radical thing she could do was refuse to be used, by others or by her own past. She did not redeem the families she had helped destroy. That was not possible. She did not erase the damage. That would have been a lie. Instead, she chose something smaller, obscurity. Ruth lived out her remaining years in a place where no one knew her name long enough to attach meaning to it. She worked, she rested, she aged. She helped when help did not require control. She listened when listening did not invite leverage. When she died, there was no marker that told her story. Only a woman remembered by some as quiet, by others as strange, by a few as kind. Somewhere, far away, families still whispered about a curse they never fully understood, about a presence that preceded collapse, about a woman whose silence carried consequences. They were wrong. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. She had never been a curse. She had been a mirror. And when the mirror finally chose to turn away, the world was left to confront itself, without guidance, without distortion, without someone quietly rearranging its fears. That was her final act. Not destruction, but refusal. And in that refusal, Ruth finally became free.